Please, Coco. I know we have a complicated history, but Jason needs your help. He's facing 10 years, my Uncle Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper in my office. His eyes, once filled with disdain when looking at me, now brimmed with desperation. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch between us. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same man who once told my adoptive parents that I would never amount to anything meaningful was now sitting before me, begging for my expertise. That's a serious charge, I finally replied, my voice measured and professional. Possession with intent to distribute is difficult to beat, especially with the quantity involved. Robert's shoulders slumped. He's a good kid who made a mistake. Your Aunt Denise hasn't stopped crying since the arrest. I nodded, remembering my aunt's kindness during family gatherings, the only one who made an effort to include me, even as Robert kept his distance. My name is Coco Bennett. I'm 32 years old and a criminal defense attorney at Pearson & Associates in Chicago. I specialize in cases that others consider impossible to win. My record speaks for itself. 23 not guilty verdicts in the last 5 years. What started as a childhood dream of justice has become my reality. When I was 7, the Bennett family adopted me after my biological mother passed away. They gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise. James and Catherine Bennett, my adoptive parents, were wealthy, educated, and determined to give me every advantage. But not everyone in the family welcomed a little black girl into their privileged white world. Uncle Robert had fought against my adoption from the beginning. Someone from her background won't fit in with our family, he'd argued. It's not natural. The words reached my young ears despite the adults' attempts to shield me. Even at 7, I understood what he meant. My skin color and poverty were problems to him. Now, 25 years later, the tables had turned dramatically. Robert's son, my cousin Jason, was facing serious drug charges that could derail his future. And I was possibly his best hope for avoiding prison. I'll need all the case documents, I said, reaching for a legal pad. And I want to speak with Jason alone. Relief washed over Robert's face. Thank you, Coco. We'll never forget this. As he fumbled with his briefcase to retrieve the papers, a news alert pinged on my phone. I glanced down and felt my stomach drop. The prosecutor assigned to Jason's case was Thomas Wells, an ambitious DA with political aspirations and a personal vendetta against me since I'd humiliated him in court last year. This wasn't going to be just any case. Wells would push for maximum sentencing, using every trick to win. I looked back at Robert, wondering if he knew just how complicated this situation was about to become. My journey to becoming the lawyer sitting across from Uncle Robert was anything but smooth. After the Bennett family adopted me, I worked twice as hard as everyone else to prove I belonged. My adoptive parents were supportive, but the extended family, particularly Robert, watched me with skeptical eyes, waiting for me to fail. At family gatherings, Robert would showcase his son Jason's achievements while barely acknowledging mine. Jason made the honor roll again, he'd announce proudly, then glance at me with a look that said, "Bet you can't match that." When I did match or exceed Jason's accomplishments, my successes were attributed to the advantages James and Catherine provide, rather than my own abilities. Despite this, I excelled academically. I graduated at the top of my high school class, earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University, and eventually graduated from Yale Law School. Each achievement was a personal victory, a step toward proving my worth not just to my family but to myself. My relationship with cousin Jason was complicated. 4 years younger than me, he wasn't openly hostile, but he absorbed his father's attitudes. At family dinners, he'd sometimes ask inappropriate questions. "Do you know who your real dad is?" Or, "Did you live in the projects?" His curiosity wasn't malicious, but it always reminded me that I was seen as different. As the years passed, I saw less of Robert and his family. My career took priority, and I limited family gatherings to major holidays. Robert seemed relieved by my absence. At my law school graduation, he offered a stiff "congratulations" before quickly moving away to speak with James about some business matter. I built my reputation as a formidable defense attorney by taking on cases others deemed hopeless. My approach was methodical, exhaustive research, creative legal strategies, and a deep understanding of human psychology. I knew how to connect with juries, how to humanize my clients regardless of their alleged crimes. My success rate earned me recognition and a rapid rise at my firm. Through mutual acquaintances, I occasionally heard about Jason. He'd dropped out of college, was finding himself, and had fallen in with a questionable crowd. Robert never volunteered this information during family gatherings, though his proud announcements about his son had noticeably ceased. Last Thanksgiving, I overheard a hushed conversation between my adoptive mother and Aunt Denise. "We're worried about Jason," Denise had whispered. "Robert doesn't know what to do anymore." I didn't pry then, assuming it was typical parental concern over a young adult's choices. In retrospect, that conversation had been an early warning sign of trouble brewing. Trouble that would eventually land Robert in my office, swallowing his pride to ask for help. What I didn't know then was that Robert's attitude toward me hadn't softened with time. Just 3 months before his visit to my office, at my parents' anniversary celebration, he'd pulled James aside and said, "You did a noble thing with Coco, but wasn't it exhausting raising someone else's problem?" My father had immediately shut him down, but the comment made its way back to me through a well-meaning cousin. The words stung, proving that despite my accomplishments, Robert still saw me as an outsider, a charity case rather than family. The case file for Jason Bennett was worse than I'd initially thought. As I sat in my apartment that evening reviewing the documents Robert had provided, the gravity of the situation became clear. Jason had been caught with enough cocaine to trigger mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. The evidence was substantial: drugs in his apartment, digital scales, baggies, and text messages that strongly suggested dealing. I poured another glass of wine and spread the police reports across my coffee table. The arresting officers had followed proper procedure. The search warrant was solid. No obvious technicalities to exploit. Thomas Wells would have an easy path to conviction unless I found something the police had missed. My phone rang, my adoptive mother calling for our weekly check-in. "How are you, sweetheart?" Catherine asked. "I'm fine, Mom. Just working late on a new case." "Robert told us about Jason's situation," she said carefully, "and that he asked for your help." I sighed. "I'm reviewing the file now. It doesn't look good." "Coco," her voice softened, "you don't owe Robert anything, not after how he's treated you." The comment caught me off guard. My parents rarely acknowledged the tension between Robert and me, preferring to maintain family harmony. "What do you mean?" A pause. "James and I hoped his attitude would change over time, but we've heard things over the years. The way he talks about you when you're not around." My throat tightened. "Like what?" "It doesn't matter now," she backpedaled. "Just know that if you choose not to help Jason, we'll understand completely." After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence. All these years, I'd thought my parents were oblivious to Robert's subtle digs and exclusionary behavior. Instead, they'd been aware but had chosen not to confront it. Had they been protecting me? Or themselves from family conflict? The next morning, I met with Jason at the county jail. He looked smaller than I remembered, his confident demeanor replaced by fear. "Cousin Coco," he said, attempting a smile, "Dad said you'd help me." "I'm considering it," I replied neutrally. "But first, I need the truth. All of it." Jason's story unfolded haltingly. He'd started selling to support his own habit, which had begun during his second year of college. The arrest wasn't bad luck. It was the inevitable conclusion of choices made over years. "Does your father know about your addiction?" I asked. Jason laughed bitterly. "Dad doesn't believe in addiction. He thinks it's a weakness of character." That sounded like Robert. As our conversation continued, something shifted in me. Despite our history, Jason was family. And unlike his father, he'd never deliberately hurt me. As I was leaving, Jason called after me. "Why would you help me?" Dad's been terrible to you. I turned back. I'm not doing it for him. Driving to the courthouse to review the evidence firsthand, I called my investigator, Devin, and asked him to dig deeper into the case. I need anything that might help create reasonable doubt. While waiting for the evidence clerk, I ran into Thomas Wells in the hallway. "Counselor Bennett," he said with a smirk. "Heard you're representing your cousin. Family loyalty is touching, but this is an open and shut case. We'll see about that." His smile widened. "Robert Bennett's son. Ironic that he needs your help, isn't it? Especially considering what your uncle said during the Bar Association dinner last year." I felt a chill. "What are you talking about?" "Oh," Wells feigned surprise. "You didn't hear? He was quite vocal about how affirmative action helped certain attorneys advance beyond their qualifications. The context made it clear who he was referring to." Blood rushed to my face as Wells walked away, satisfied he'd landed a blow. I stood frozen, processing this new information. Robert hadn't just dismissed me privately, he'd publicly undermined my professional accomplishments, suggesting I hadn't earned my success. The evidence clerk called my name, but I barely heard her. I'd been considering helping Jason despite Robert's past behavior, but this was different. This struck at the core of my identity as a lawyer, the one thing I'd built entirely on my own. The next morning, I walked into my office to find Robert waiting. He'd brought coffee and pastries, an obvious attempt to curry favor. "I thought we could discuss strategy," he said, gesturing to the food. "I've been researching similar cases online." I sat down at my desk without touching the offerings. "Before we start, I need to ask you something. At the Bar Association dinner last year, did you suggest I've benefited from affirmative action?" His face flushed. "That's not exactly..." "It's a yes or no question, Robert." He shifted uncomfortably. "It might have come up in conversation. Legal circles can be competitive, and sometimes discussions get heated." "So you publicly undermined my professional reputation while privately hoping I'd represent your son?" My voice remained calm, despite the anger building inside me. "You're twisting my words," he protested. "I was simply stating that diversity initiatives give certain people advantages in hiring. People like me." "I didn't say that specifically. Look, Coco, this isn't about us, it's about Jason. He needs your expertise." I studied him, the man who had tried to prevent my adoption, who had consistently made me feel like an outsider, and who now wanted to brush aside his actions for his son's benefit. Part of me wanted to tell him to find another attorney, to let him experience the consequences of his behavior. But that would punish Jason more than Robert. "I'll continue representing Jason," I finally said. "But let's be clear, I'm doing this for him and Aunt Denise, not for you. And our professional relationship will remain exactly that, professional." Robert's relief was obvious, though he bristled at my conditions. "Fine. What's your plan?" I outlined my preliminary strategy, explaining that Devin was investigating the arresting officers for potential procedural violations. Additionally, I need to understand if Jason's addiction could support a defense strategy. Has he ever sought treatment? Robert's expression hardened. "There's no addiction. Jason made poor choices, but he's not an addict. I won't have that narrative in court." "The evidence suggests otherwise," I countered, "and a documented history of addiction could potentially help his case." "Absolutely not," Robert insisted. "The Bennett name still means something in this city. I won't have it tarnished with addiction stories. We'll fight this on technical grounds." His reaction confirmed what Jason had told me. Robert was more concerned with appearances than his son's well-being. I realized that any defense strategy would have to navigate not just the legal challenges, but Robert's pride as well. Later that day, Devin called with his findings. "The lead detective on Jason's case has a history of procedural shortcuts. Nothing that got cases thrown out, but enough to establish a pattern." This was the first piece of good news. "Send me everything you found. I want to depose him immediately." As I prepared for the deposition, Wells offered a plea deal. 5 years instead of 10. It was a standard offer, nothing that indicated concern about their case. I discussed it with Jason, who was willing to consider it, but Robert rejected it outright when I called him. "My son is not going to prison for 5 years," he declared. "You need to get this dismissed entirely." "That's not realistic given the evidence," I explained. "The plea might be our best option." "Then find a better option," he snapped. "Isn't that why we came to you? Your job is to keep him out of prison." I ended the call, frustration building. Robert was setting impossible expectations while limiting my strategic options. He wanted a miracle but wouldn't allow me to use all the tools at my disposal. The deposition of Detective Harmon revealed small inconsistencies in the search procedure, but nothing substantial enough to challenge the warrant. Wells watched with a satisfied expression as my line of questioning failed to uncover any major procedural violations. "Ready to reconsider that plea offer?" he asked afterward. "We're just getting started," I replied with more confidence than I felt. Back at my office, I found Robert waiting again, demanding updates. When I explained the limited progress, his demeanor shifted from anxious to accusatory. "I thought you were supposed to be exceptional," he said. "Maybe I should have gone with a more experienced attorney." The comment stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "You're welcome to seek other counsel if you're dissatisfied." He backtracked immediately. No, I just want to make sure we're exploring every avenue." As he left, I felt the weight of both professional and personal pressure mounting. I was fighting against strong evidence, an ambitious prosecutor, and my own uncle's impossible expectations and restrictions. For the first time, I questioned whether I could win this case, or if I even wanted to. 3 weeks into case preparation, Devin delivered information that changed everything. His deep background check on the prosecution's primary witness, the confidential informant who had allegedly purchased drugs from Jason multiple times, revealed a history of providing false testimony in exchange for reduced sentences in his own cases. "This could be our break," I told Jason during our next meeting. "If we can prove the informant lacks credibility, it undermines the entire foundation of the case against you." Jason seemed relieved but worried. "Will this mean discussing my problem in court?" "Eventually, yes. We'll need to address your addiction to contextualize your actions." His face fell. "Dad will never agree to that." "Your father isn't the one facing prison time," I said firmly. "This is your life we're fighting for." That evening, I invited Robert and Denise to my office to discuss the new development. I explained how attacking the informant's credibility could help Jason's case, but it would require acknowledging his addiction. "I've found a respected rehabilitation facility willing to accept Jason immediately," I continued. "Starting treatment now would demonstrate to the court that he's serious about recovery." Robert's reaction was immediate and hostile. "I already told you, we're not pursuing an addiction defense. Find another way." Denise, however, looked thoughtful. "Robert, if this could help Jason..." "It would ruin his future," Robert cut her off. "A recorded history of drug addiction would follow him forever." "A felony conviction would follow him longer," I pointed out. The argument escalated, with Robert eventually standing to leave. "I thought you were on our side, Coco. Instead, you're trying to publicly humiliate our family." As he stormed out, Denise stayed behind, her eyes filled with tears. "He's terrified," she explained, "not just of Jason going to prison, but of facing his own failure as a father." "His pride is going to cost Jason years of his life," I said. Denise reached for my hand. "There's something you should know. When you were adopted, Robert didn't just object because of prejudice. His younger brother, my first husband, died of a drug overdose a year before you came into our lives. Black market pain medications after a construction injury." The revelation landed like a physical blow. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Robert doesn't talk about it. Never has. He processed his grief by becoming rigid, judgmental. When James and Catherine wanted to adopt you, I think you represented another potential loss to him, another situation he couldn't control." This new context didn't excuse Robert's behavior, but it added complexity to my understanding of him. Still, it didn't change the reality of Jason's case or the best strategy for his defense. The next day, Wells called with a revised plea offer, 3 years, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. It was better than the previous offer, but still meant significant prison time. When I relayed this to Robert, he rejected it again and threatened to replace me if I couldn't deliver a better outcome. Frustrated, I decided to meet with Jason alone. In the visitation room, I laid out the situation plainly. Your father is limiting our defense options. I believe we could get an even better plea deal if we pursue the addiction angle, possibly even probation with mandatory treatment. Jason looked torn. He's still my dad. I don't want to go against his wishes. It's your life, Jason, not his. After a long silence, Jason straightened in his chair. Let me talk to him. One more try. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Denise, her voice tense. Robert and Jason had a huge fight. Jason told him he's an addict and needs help, not prison. Robert said some terrible things. Jason has agreed to let you pursue any defense strategy you think best. The next morning, I filed motions challenging the credibility of the confidential informant and submitted documentation from a psychiatrist who had evaluated Jason, officially diagnosing his substance use disorder. When I informed Robert of these actions, he exploded. You went behind my back, after everything our family has done for you. Everything your family has done for me? I repeated, incredulous. You tried to prevent my adoption. You've questioned my abilities and achievements my entire life. Even recently, you've publicly suggested I succeeded only because of affirmative action. That's not... Let me finish, I cut him off. Despite all that, I'm still fighting for your son because he deserves a chance. But I won't let your pride dictate my legal strategy. Robert's face contorted with anger. I'm removing you from this case. I'll find an attorney who respects my wishes. That's Jason's decision, not yours, I replied, and he's chosen to proceed with my strategy. As Robert stormed out, I felt a strange mixture of liberation and anxiety. I'd finally confronted him directly after years of enduring his subtle digs and dismissals. But now the stakes were higher than ever. If my strategy failed, Jason would pay the price, and Robert would have new ammunition to question my capabilities. 1 week before trial, I received an unexpected call from the prosecutor's office. Wells wanted to meet to discuss the case. When I arrived at his office, his typically smug expression was replaced by one of calculation. Your motion about our informant has created some complications, he admitted. His history wasn't fully disclosed to my office. I maintained a neutral expression, though internally I was celebrating this confirmation of our strategy's impact. I imagine that affects your case substantially. It presents challenges, Wells acknowledged, which is why I'm prepared to offer a new plea arrangement: probation with mandatory inpatient rehabilitation, followed by 3 years of supervised release. One misstep, and your client serves 5 years. It was significantly better than previous offers, essentially no prison time if Jason remained committed to recovery. But something felt off about Wells's sudden flexibility. What's the catch? I asked. Wells smiled thinly. No catch, but the offer expires in 48 hours. After he left, Devin called with troubling news. The prosecution just added a new witness to their list, someone named Patrick Lewis. Does that name mean anything to you? It didn't until Devin explained further. Patrick had been Jason's roommate briefly during his second year of college, around when his drug use had started. This could either help our addiction defense or provide more evidence of dealing. Without knowing what Patrick would testify to, it was impossible to assess the impact. I tried repeatedly to reach Patrick but was unsuccessful. The prosecutor's office claimed they didn't have contact information beyond what they'd provided, which I knew was untrue but couldn't prove. With the clock ticking on Wells's offer, I arranged an emergency meeting with Jason and, at his request, both his parents. In my office, I explained the plea deal and the new witness situation. This is a good offer, I told them. Probation instead of prison with treatment for your addiction. But we need to decide quickly. Jason seemed inclined to accept, but Robert remained skeptical. What if this new witness helps our case? We could potentially get a full dismissal. Or he could provide damaging testimony that strengthens their case, I countered. This is a bird in hand versus two in the bush situation. Denise spoke up. I think we should take the deal. Jason needs treatment more than he needs a legal victory. Robert turned to his wife, surprise evident on his face. It was perhaps the first time I'd seen her directly contradict him. The dynamic between them shifted visibly as she held his gaze without backing down. After a tense silence, Robert asked me, "What would you do if it were your child?" The question caught me off guard, not just its content, but the fact that he was genuinely asking my opinion. I'd take the deal, I said honestly. The evidence against Jason is substantial. This offer gives him a chance to rebuild his life without the shadow of imprisonment. Jason looked at his father. Dad, I want to take it. I need help, not a legal miracle. Something in Robert seemed to crumble. The rigid posture, the certainty that had defined him in my eyes for decades. It all gave way to the vulnerability of a father facing his son's pain. Okay, he said quietly. I began preparing the necessary paperwork, relief washing over me. But that evening, Devin called again. I found Patrick Lewis. He was arrested last night for possession. The same detective who arrested Jason brought him in. My suspicions flared. That's too coincidental. It gets worse. He's claiming Jason was his supplier in college. Says he has text messages to prove it. The revelation sent me reeling. If Patrick testified to this and provided evidence, it could torpedo our addiction defense. The prosecution could argue Jason had been dealing for years, making him appear more calculating than troubled. I spent the night reviewing every document in the case, searching for anything we might have missed. By morning, I had formed a desperate but potentially effective strategy. At the courthouse, before I could officially accept the plea deal, I requested a private meeting with Wells. I know what you're doing with Patrick Lewis, I said without preamble. The timing of his arrest, his sudden willingness to testify against my client, it reeks of coercion. Wells maintained his poker face. That's a serious accusation, counselor. It is, I agreed, and one I'm prepared to raise formally if necessary. But first, I want you to see something. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of Detective Harmon's case history, specifically 3 instances where confidential informants had changed their stories after being arrested by him. This establishes a pattern that could raise serious questions about your department's tactics, I explained. Questions no ambitious prosecutor wants attached to his name during an election year. Wells's expression remained neutral, but I could see him reassessing. What's your point? I want the original deal. Probation with treatment, but with no contingent prison time if he relapses. Addiction recovery often includes setbacks. One failed test shouldn't mean 5 years behind bars. After a tense standoff, Wells agreed. Whether it was the strength of my argument or his concern about potential procedural misconduct allegations, he revised the deal. When I presented the improved offer to Jason and his parents, their relief was palpable. As the paperwork was finalized, I felt the weight of weeks of stress begin to lift. Against considerable odds, we had secured a resolution that gave Jason the chance he needed. 1 month after Jason began treatment at New Horizons Rehabilitation Center, I received an unexpected invitation to meet with Robert at his office. Curious but cautious, I agreed. His workspace reflected his personality, meticulously organized, traditionally furnished, projecting stability and success. As I entered, he stood awkwardly, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I wanted to meet somewhere private to express my gratitude for what you did for Jason." "I was doing my job," I replied evenly. "No," he shook his head. "You did more than that. You fought for him despite how I've treated you over the years." The admission hung in the air between us. Robert looked older somehow, the confident businessman facade replaced by something more human and uncertain. I visited Jason yesterday, he continued. His counselor said something that's been echoing in my mind. She said that addiction thrives in secrecy and shame. That by trying to hide Jason's struggles, I was actually making recovery harder for him. I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. It made me think about other things I've kept hidden behind pride and silence, like my brother's death, and my behavior toward you. Robert's voice wavered slightly. I've spent 25 years being wrong about you, Coco. From the moment James and Catherine brought you home, I was wrong. He opened his desk drawer and removed a framed photograph I'd never seen, a younger Robert with his arm around another man who shared his features. This is Patrick, my brother. After he died, I became fixated on the idea that I could have saved him if I'd been stricter, less accepting of his phases. When you came into our family, I projected all those fears onto you. That explains some things, I acknowledged, but it doesn't excuse treating a child as if they're predestined to fail because of their background. You're right, he agreed, surprising me. There is no excuse. Only a flawed man who couldn't separate his fears from reality, who couldn't see that a brilliant young girl deserved every opportunity, regardless of where she came from. The courtroom had prepared me for many scenarios, but not for the sight of my uncle's eyes filling with tears. I was there when you graduated law school, he continued. Sitting in the back. I heard them announce your honors, watched you walk across that stage. And do you know what I felt? Fear. Because your success challenged everything I'd convinced myself was true. He placed a wrapped box on the desk between us. This doesn't make up for anything, but I hope it might represent a new beginning. Inside was a beautifully crafted nameplate for my desk, Coco Bennett Esquire. Simple, elegant, an acknowledgement of my professional identity. I'm proud to share a family name with you, Robert said quietly, if you'll still claim us as family. The transformation in Robert wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was profound. Over the following months, as Jason progressed through his recovery program, Robert began his own healing journey. He attended family therapy sessions, confronting decades of unprocessed grief and rigid thinking patterns. Our family dynamics shifted. At holiday gatherings, Robert no longer held court with practiced anecdotes and subtle hierarchies. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, his newfound humility creating space for authentic connection. 6 months after our office meeting, I was offered a partnership at my firm, the youngest attorney ever to achieve that status. The celebration dinner, organized by my parents, included Robert and Denise. When my father proposed a toast, Robert asked if he could add something. 25 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life by trying to prevent Coco from joining our family, he said, his voice steady but emotional. Thank God I failed. She has not only proven me wrong in every possible way, she has shown a capacity for excellence and compassion that humbles me daily. Jason completed his rehabilitation program successfully and enrolled in community college, studying to become a substance abuse counselor. During a family dinner celebrating his 6 months of sobriety, he pulled me aside. You could have used my case to get back at my dad, he said. No one would have blamed you. Instead, you gave me a chance to rebuild my life. That's what family does, I replied simply. My practice expanded to include more addiction-related cases, drawing on what I'd learned through Jason's experience. I established a scholarship for law students from underrepresented backgrounds, naming it after my biological mother. The first recipient was a young woman from circumstances similar to mine, bright, determined, and in need of someone who believed in her potential. Robert became one of the scholarship's most generous donors. When I asked him why, his answer was simple. I'm trying to balance the scales. As my professional reputation continued to grow, I often reflected on the complex journey that had brought me to this point. The painful history with Robert had ultimately made me more determined, more resilient, and perhaps more compassionate. I had proven myself not by seeking revenge, but by embodying excellence, and in doing so, had changed not just my own story, but Robert's as well. At the firm's annual charity gala, Thomas Wells approached me, sporting his usual smug smile. I heard Bennett made a substantial donation to your scholarship fund. Trying to buy forgiveness for past sins? I regarded him calmly. Family is complicated, Wells. Something you might understand if you focus less on winning and more on what justice actually means. As he walked away, visibly unsettled by my response, I felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun with rejection had transformed into acceptance, not through dramatic confrontation or elaborate revenge, but through the steady power of living well and offering grace where it wasn't deserved. The 7-year-old girl who had once eavesdropped on adults debating her worth had become a woman capable of extending the very belonging she had once been denied. There was a certain justice in that, quieter than courtroom victories, but ultimately more profound.